Welcome back to Niaga AWANI. My name is Ibrahim. So to continue our coverage on some of the biggest news in the business world, of course, we want to focus on the economics as well of this side of the coin. Joining us on the line is Nazmi Idrus, the head economist at CGSM Securities. Nazmi, thanks very much for taking the time to speak with us. I want to touch a little bit more on some of the inflation issues, particularly on what's driving inflation. What do you think is some of the factors that you can share with us driving inflation, particularly in food prices and food inflation?
Alright, thank you Ibrahim, thank you for having me here. So basically kenaikan harga barang adalah disebabkan oleh beberapa faktor. Faktor paling utama adalah berpunca daripada permintaan disebabkan oleh pembukaan sepadan dan kesan pemulihan ekonomi pasca COVID-19. Jadi kenaikan permintaan ini melebihi keupayaan pembekal untuk menampung paras pengeluaran, jadi harga menaik. Sebab kedua adalah kesan dari perang di Ukraine. Russia dan Ukraine adalah pengeluar besar beberapa barangan seperti bahan api, gandum dan juga jagung. Jagung terutamanya merupakan salah satu bahan makanan utama untuk penghasilan ayam. Faktor ketiga adalah masalah kekurangan pekerja. Ini kita sedia maklum, dan masalah ini bukan sahaja di Malaysia tapi juga di kebanyakan negara lain juga.
Baik, inflasi makanan pada bulan Mei adalah antara tertinggi sejak November 2011. Apakah yang mendorong kenaikan pada bulan Mei ini dan adakah unjuran CGSMB berkenaan dengan inflasi makanan akan berterusan sehingga bulan-bulan yang mendatang ni?
Okey, ya. Pihak kami menjangkakan yang tekanan harga akan berterusan sekurang-kurangnya beberapa bulan lagi. Ini disebabkan oleh harga komoditi terutamanya bahan api yang masih lagi tinggi. Jika kita lihat harga Brent oil sekarang ini melonjak pada bulan Mei hampir $130 setong. Hingga sekarang masih kekal tinggi hingga ke paras $115 setong. Tambahan juga semalam kerajaan telah mengumumkan semalam hari Rabu kerajaan telah mengumumkan kenaikan harga ayam sebanyak 50 sen kepada RM9 sekilo, dan juga minggu sebelumnya menghentikan subsidi untuk minyak masak berbotol. So ini akan menambah kepada tekanan inflasi pada masa hadapan.
Selain daripada inflasi makanan, ada juga beberapa sektor ataupun segmen inflation yang kita nak keep an eye out on. Adakah forecast CGSMB berkenaan dengan inflation on all the other sectors outside of the food sector is going to be remaining high? What is your view on that?
So, kerajaan telah mengumumkan untuk mengekalkan harga elektrik untuk second half of this year. So that means itu mengelakkan risiko kenaikan harga dari segi elektrik lah, dan kita juga menjangkakan bahawa subsidi minyak akan terus kekal sehingga hujung tahun ini, di mana kerajaan akan kebarangkalian untuk mengekalkan harga sehingga election lah. Jadi unjuran inflasi kami untuk tahun ini adalah 3.1%. So lebih tinggi berbanding inflasi tahun lepas di 2.5%. Dan ini walaupun unjuran ini lebih tinggi, tapi ia adalah kalau dibandingkan dengan inflasi di negara lain adalah masih lagi rendah. Ini disebabkan oleh kebanyakan benda yang kita belanja sekarang ni harganya telah dikekalkan oleh kerajaan.
Okay, Nazmi, kita nak tengok reality versus what is published by the authorities, DOSM and central banks and all the others. This is because CPI, for instance, or indeks harga pengguna mencatatkan 2 hingga 3% kenaikan dalam harga-harga bahan makanan. Tetapi kalau kita tengok minyak mentah, minyak masak dah meningkat beberapa kali ganda. Where is the discrepancy in terms of the reality of prices at the supermarket versus the ones that is being published by the authorities?
Okay, so perbezaan indeks harga pengguna dengan apa yang kita alami sebenarnya ialah berdasarkan pengiraan indeks harga pengguna itu sendiri. Yang pertama, sumbangan setengah barang makanan dalam indeks harga pengguna adalah kecil. Contohnya minyak masak menyumbang hanya 0.6% bahagian kepada indeks harga pengguna. Dan ayam contohnya, ayam dan daging hanya menyumbang 2.5% kepada indeks harga pengguna. Jadi jika harga ayam naik, indeks harga pengguna tidak akan melonjak dengan begitu tinggi. Yang kedua adalah kadar pembelanjaan adalah berbeza bagi setiap pengguna. Bagi mereka yang berpendapatan rendah, pembelanjaan untuk minyak masak adalah lebih besar jika dibandingkan dengan gaji mereka. Tapi indeks harga pengguna ni adalah purata, ia tak kira kaya atau miskin, tak kira bandar atau pedalaman. Jadi setengah pengguna kenaikan harga ni adalah lebih terkesan kerana pembelanjaan mereka adalah lebih banyak. Jadi sebenarnya inflasi ini bagi setiap individu adalah berbeza, bergantung kepada kadar perbelanjaan mereka. Yang kita lihat pada headline yang kerajaan umumkan itu adalah purata bagi rata-rata bagi untuk rakyat.
Okay, now we're looking at some currency movements because the ringgit extended its downtrend on the US dollar, perhaps due to the stronger US dollar index as US Federal Reserve Jerome Powell reiterated his stance on keeping the idea of raising interest rates further. This is, of course, to quell his inflation numbers. And of course, right now we're looking at 4.4 ringgit to a dollar. How do you think this is impacting our cost of importing goods and services? This is goods, particularly food import. Do you think that this is the one that is driving up inflation?
I think it does play a factor into driving prices higher, but it really depends on the strategy of the company and how are they planning on hedging against the weakness in the ringgit. Some companies are able to actually increase immediately the prices that they actually experience and pass it down straight to consumers. Some companies, the strategy is actually to raise the prices gradually, so step by step. And certain companies certain industries that are more competitive, they actually are usually not able to actually pass it down to consumer very effectively. So they're probably going to have take a bit of losses, and they might actually see a smaller profit margin before they actually started to increase prices down to consumer. But overall, weaker ringgit do have an impact to cost of importers. So importers eventually will start to pass it down to consumers over time.
You know, I want to move away from inflation and talk about growth and the macroeconomics as well. We're looking at a possibility of a stagflation. Do you think that there's a risk of stagflation and even a recession moving on in the near future?
When we talk about stagflation or recession, I think this is more of a term that is more used in the US because right now the probability of the US going into a recession or stagflation is about 50-50, whereas 50% chance of a recession and a 50% chance of economic slowdown, whereby the economy is still growing, is still positive, it's just not as strong as before. Now, the risk is more on the global economic growth if you are actually going into a recession or a slowdown. But for Malaysia, we actually still estimate growth to be positive. The only concern or the only risk is actually coming from the global economy, where it can actually affect our Malaysian export. So the effect of the global recession or the stagflation likely to be felt on the export industries.
Okay, speaking about export industries, we're looking at two big markets here, US and China. Of course, our closest neighbor, Singapore as well, remains to be on the radar. What would be some of the risks that you can think about or you can share with us this morning when it comes to these export markets being at risk, considering that the global slow downturn is going to impact these kind of markets?
As you know, US is slowing down, China is slowing down. So these are the both our major markets. And with the slowdown in the US and China, we're likely to see the economy of Malaysia trickling down. The advantage that we have with respect to Malaysia is that the government have spent quite a substantial amount of subsidy. And as you know, if you read the news recently, they actually announced that about 77.3 billion just for this year. If you compare with last year, subsidy was at 31 billion, and last year we had 2 rounds of lockdowns. So the amount of support that the government have put into the economy makes the economic makes inflation tapered down, and that actually mitigate the effect of the consumer, where the consumer have to cut down on purchases. That's not happening in Malaysia like what we've seen in other countries. So that is actually an upside risk to Malaysia, whereby the private consumption is not so much affected by the high inflation, and thus they will continue to spend. So this is expected to continue to support um, um, economic recovery. But the risk is now is that if commodity prices continue to remain high, especially for Brent prices, if it remains about this level, $120 or $110 per barrel, that means that the government will have to continue to spend more and more just to keep prices low. At some point, the government may have to readjust prices, and when that happens, we're likely to see the economy started to slow down a little bit, where consumers start to cut down.
Okay, that's of course under the consideration that the government must or continue to pump in subsidies into the market. Right now, we know that for a fact that that's not sustainable. You mentioned yourself the numbers don't look promising to continue on these massive subsidy programs in the future. 77 billion versus 31 billion or so in the years before. So, do you think that the subsidies can actually go on in the future, considering that the subsidy bill is actually quite high?
Correct. We don't think that it would last forever. Of course, if commodity prices remain high, the government may have to readjust prices. And we already seen this happening right now, where chicken prices has been increased. The subsidy for bottled cooking oil has been removed. The government have mentioned that they are looking into targeted subsidy going forward. And from our standpoint, we believe that this might be, where the one who are the T20 group or the rich groups of people who are able to actually pay market price for fuel, whereas the poor, the B40 and the M40 might likely to experience continued subsidy. So subsidy adjustments is likely to be more gradual. I don't think government will suddenly post-election, for instance, suddenly increase prices dramatically. It's likely to be very gradual, just to smoothen out or just to prevent significant disruption to consumer spending.
Of course, one key item that I want to still ask you is on the political risk. Do you feel that this is going to, I guess, hamper any efforts on trying to stabilize the inflation rate, trying to stabilize the higher prices of food, petrol, oil, and the likes? Where do you think CGS-CIMB is when it comes to the political risk in the country?
For us, at the moment, we do project that things will remain status quo. Economic-wise, things will remain status quo for this year. For next year, at the moment, our assumption is for an election in early part of the year. And post that, but I think we do believe that policy-wise things will probably likely to remain the same.
Okay.
What the government has planned for this year and next year probably remain the same and unchanged, even though there's change in the political environment.
Okay. Final question, Nazmi, before we head off for our weekend. The targeted fuel subsidy. We're very interested in how the mechanism is being rolled out, if it ever is being announced by the government. Where does CGS-CIMB stand when it comes to the targeted subsidy programs that the government wants to do? Do you look into the weeds of how this is going to be done?
We have some ideas of how it will be done, but like everyone else, this is $1 million question. We don't know how it's going to be done. The government has mentioned that it's looking for a more targeted approach. We don't know. In past,
I guess that's the highlight, right? We don't know.
Yes. No. If you think about the past measures that they've done, if you remember the petrol card that they actually introduced, that actually never seen the light of the day, right? So we don't know how they're gonna plan on doing this, but they have actually mentioned it in the pre-budget. So we are actually waiting for how the mechanism will work.
Fantastic. And while we wait for the mechanism to be announced, we shall now depart from this interview. That was Nazmi Idros, head economist at CGS-CIMB Securities, dialing in from Kuala Lumpur. And that's all that we have for this entire week. I do wish you a very good weekend. And of course, this has been a long week for us here in Astro AWANI. But of course, we continue to remain vigilant on the markets and the market updates. Until then, thanks very much for watching. My name is Ibrahim Sani. See you again next week.